So after years of session work, playing in my local scene, and then retiring from that during the lockdown periods, and then finally getting back to writing over that period, and well, that's led us to 2023, where a new album came out, which is the first time I've done a full album, and it's also meant the return of live shows, but actually live shows for my own music, which, I'll be honest, I can't believe that's actually a thing now. It's crazy to think that after all the years of playing for other people, I'm finally doing my own thing like I've always wanted to do. And as such, that meant having to figure out how to play this music live. And it took quite a bit of time to figure out the rig, figure out how we're going to do it, and make it in a way that would still be quite impressive to look at as well, because it's very easy to just use a laptop and nothing else, but I didn't really want to go down that route. I wanted as much live as possible. So hopefully, by running through this rig, it might be useful to other people who are in the same boat as I was, trying to put this sort of rig together. This is actually the third attempt at trying to film this, 2 down at the studio, which just didn't really go to plan. Turns out other bands are really loud, and it's really hard to get clear audio on a camera when there's a metal band next door playing at what feels like 300 decibels. So in the end, I've ended up doing it at home. I will cut in some photos from the various shoots we've done, just so we can get some clear shots. But hopefully this covers everything that yous have been asking for, because this is actually the most requested video on my channel probably ever. I mean, it's not a big channel, so it's not like I get a lot of requests, but from the requests I do get, this is probably the most requested thing I've had. So hopefully I cover everything. If not though, leave it down in the comments below and I'll try and answer as best as I can any questions people have. And with this rig, we're going to split it into 3. There's going to be the bass rig, because of course there's a big bass rig for my setup, the synth table, or the modular table as we're probably calling it now, and thirdly the Ableton rig. We'll get on all that. We'll put timestamps as well if you want to jump to any specific sections from those 3. I will also kind of caveat all of this just now with, this was the rig for this year's shows, which are only a couple. Things are going to change drastically for 2024, where we'll have other shows as well, and also another new album coming out. So we've had to change things up quite a bit. So we've kind of addressed that throughout the video where it's relevant. But I think that's enough introduction. Let's get to the rig. So the first thing is my bass rig, and it all starts with this, my Fretless Harley Benton jazz bass. These are a really great bass if you're looking to get into fretless bass. They're really affordable and are a really nice bass. I mean, I've not got a huge amount of experience with the Harley Benton stuff on other instruments, so I can't speak for those, but the fretless bass is really good. It's got a nice neck on it, a really nice plain jazz bass. Also has heaps of sentimental value for me because it was a gift from my parents, and it's still one of the main basses I play to this day, and I love it. So that's where everything kind of starts. It is probably the main bass in the rig, although if people were at the Glasgow show you've seen another bass which we'll come on in a little bit. I will be adding some other fretless stuff in the future, because just a little bit of a spoiler, the next album is all fretless bass. There are no other guitars used on the album, it's all this. So I might need to add a couple more fretless basses for live use. So yeah, this is the fretless bass I've been using this year. It's got the Dario round wound strings, 45 to 105 gauge, which is what I use on all my basses. No modifications to it whatsoever. It's got Wilkinson pickups because this is one of the older ones, and it's also got a Groove Gear fret wrap, which I use on one of the songs just to kind of mute further up for synth bass stuff. And that's it. Pretty bog standard stuff. The other bass I've been using on anything that needed frets was this one. Got used on quite a bit of the old material that I tried to rework for live use, although now I actually use the fretless bass for most of it. That's kind of the progression we've had over the course of the year. So this actually was only getting used for 2 songs by the time we did the last gig. So yeah, really nice bass though. It's a Squire Paranormal jazz bass, which if you don't know what that means, it's a jazz bass made to look with like the aesthetic, that wasn't even English, made to look like the 51 P-bass aesthetic, or the 50s P-bass aesthetic, with the dual concentric pots to give it that telly pickguard thing, and then the 50s P-bass pickguard. I really like the look of these. It's a really nice bass. It's just a shame it has frets. But hopefully that might change in the future. And again, 45 to 105 D'Addario strings. And the last guitar we've been using is this Danelectro baritone. It's tuned B to B, so it's like a 7-string guitar without a high E string, the way I'm using it. I know there are other baritone tunings, but that's just what I've been going with. It's a really nice guitar. Not sure what strings are on this. I think they're D'Addario, but I could be wrong. I do have a D'Addario set as a backup, but I'm not changing these unless I need to, because I like the tone off of it just now. Really light. It's completely hollow, like all Danelectro guitars are and should be. And it plays great. It's a really nice guitar. Currently being used on one song in the set, which is actually a really old jam thing I did on Instagram. Not Instagram, did on YouTube even, over here. And it was done on a 6-string bass. Not a bass 6, but a kind of big 6-string bass. B to G, no, B to C tuning, so B, E, A, D, G, C. And I sold that bass, which I highly regret, which kind of makes the video I did a few months back a little bit redundant now about mostly playing a 6-string bass, because I don't have one now. But it's, yeah, that was a mistake of mine to sell that, something I will rectify in the future. But this actually served as the perfect replacement for the gigs. Now, I did say that the new album will only be fretless bass. This is the only grey area. I might be doing a song on this, or I might still play it on the fretless, depending on how it goes. So, you may see this in the future, you may not. Depends how we go with that. But that's it for all the guitars. The one thing I will add, which I can show you on this guitar actually, are these strap locks. Please, if you're playing guitar live, or standing up with a guitar at all, please get some strap locks. I've seen disasters where guitars fall off of straps, and it's not worth the hassle that comes with that. These are quite cheap, if I can get this off of the guitar. These are the Ernie Ball ones, but there's lots of brands do them. The Grosh bottle top ones. Let's see if I can get that to zoom in on it. There we go. They work great, and you can get a pack of them for like £5 to £10 for 4 of them, I think. So highly recommend that if you're going to be standing up with the guitar. And the only other thing really to add in is that I use D'Addario 0.88 Tortex picks. They are what I go for. Use that on everything just now. I do also sometimes use a thumb pick. I've got a couple of different options with that, but for the most part, it's these. So after the basses, the next thing is the pedal board, which is the heart of my rig really. Let's be honest, I need to use a lot of pedals. I can't really get away with having a channel like this and not using those pedals on stage. So I'll cut over that footage now so you can see what's going on there. So the rig starts here with the Bonafide buffer, which feeds into a Korg pitch black tuner, and from there into the Electro-Harmonix tri-parallel mixer. So to quickly explain what that mixer is, it's actually the centre of all of this rig. And basically it takes that signal in from the tuner and buffer and splits it into 3. So splits it into, if you think about 3 train tracks. So it's like you can run along 3 separate chains at the same time. And then at the end of it, it brings those 3 tracks back together into one output, which is fantastic for a rig like mine. I used to have to run 3 amplifier sim preamp pedals, and it was a lot of work. It was also a lot of work for the sound engineer to have to understand how my sound was meant to sound, because sometimes sounds were louder than they should have been in the overall mix. This takes away all of that. I do all of that signal processing through this and then give one DI output via the Mark bass amplifier to front of house. This mixer is taking that signal and splitting it into 3. So we've got 3 different signals here that we can bring in and out. What we have going on with this is we have 4 controls for each loop. We have a send, a return, the volume that's been sent to the effects, which is this first one. Then we've got the return volume. I've got a phase switch, which allows us to flip the phase on a chain in case there's a pedal in the chain that has some phase issues, and then a single EQ control, which basically just fully to the right is treble, to the left is bass response, so boosting bottom end or rolling off treble to the left, more trebly to the right. I leave them pretty much flat on all 3 of those. And then we've also got the dry volume to the right there, and we've got the master volume as well. So the dry volume is a blend for the dry signal, which is very handy in my rig. And then the master volume is the level being sent out to the last chain that goes to the mark bass. So there's 3 different chains on this pedal, and the first one is all on the right here. So this first chain starts with the pedal top right hand corner right now, and that is the Calavera Effects Rocan Boost. And after that Rocan Boost, which is just like it says on the tin, it's a boost pedal. Bit gritty, really nice. Cuts a little bit of bottom end, which for melody sounds, which is what this chain is really cool. From there it runs into the Calavera Delirium Fuzz, which is a silicon fuzz face, again really cool. From there the 1991, which is from Funny Little Boxes, really cool overdrive, giving it, well, its standard function is to give you the sound of the 10 album by the band Pearl Jam, but for me it's just a really powerful overdrive. Again, scoops some bottom end, which works really well for the melody functions in the setup. Bottom right is the Scran, which is where it comes after the 1991 from Soundlad Liverpool, and that pedal is really running as a clean boost just now, but it can do so much more than that. I say clean boost, it's not even really a clean boost. It's a boost I use for level boost, but also a little bit of grit for when I've been using the baritone guitar for some of the newer stuff. Although I'm not sure it'll still be the baritone on the album, that's kind of to be confirmed. From there it goes into the octave up, which is from Gojira Effects. Nice analogue octave up. When you play bottom end notes or low notes, it has lots of filtery attack, and then also you get that octave up effect when you use it in the top end. Really cool. From there it goes on to the Belter Skelter, which is another Soundlad pedal, a key component of my overdrive sound on the melody, on for most of the time, to be honest with you. Key component in the song 41Hz as well. And then from there we have the Vox Wah, which is just the bog standard, cheapest Vox Wah you can buy. Scoops lots of bottom end. Altogether not great for bass, but in my setup it works really, really well. And then from there, the Ernie Ball Ambient Delay, which is a really cool delay pedal that works like a wah, but that's the, how would you put it, the mix control. Or is it the mix control? No, I'm being silly. It's the repeats, so basically the feedback. But I suppose it is the mix as well, because it's the mix for the reverb. Brings in how much of the reverb you're getting. And yeah, brilliant delay pedal. I don't tap tempo it, I just use the one setting and blend in how much of it I want in my rig. It works really well doing that. And then from there it's the G-Lab Spectral Reverb, which is a shimmer reverb, which I use for 2 songs in the set, I think. And again, just works great for that. And then that runs into half of the Ditto X4. As you can see, there's 2 inputs and 2 outputs being used, and one of them is for this rig, and from there it feeds back into the Electro Harmonics mixer, and that is the far right channel on the mixer. And the middle channel is a lot simpler. It's actually just that chorus pedal you see, which is a CE3 from 1984, I think, something like that. And then from there into the Gojira Effects Octave Generator, which in my opinion is hands down the greatest analogue octave pedal you can buy. You can see right next to it there's an OC2, which is one of the most iconic octave pedals ever made, but I just think the Gojira's 10 times better. It's got so much more clarity in the mid-range, just sounds amazing. And it's why that's the one that gets played solo on a few occasions, so there's no other effects with it. If I could, I would have 2 of those in my rig and save the OC2 for studio use, because also it's a vintage pedal, but man, such a cool pedal. So anyway, tangent over, the Gojira Octave Generator feeds back into the mixer. And the third chain running from the Electro Harmonics is into the OC2 from Boss, which then feeds into the Duff Beer Can Sub Fuzz from Gojira Effects. Hopefully I got that name right. It's been a long day. And then from there into the Tone Bender, which is a great name for that pedal. It's a tone bender, as you would expect. Again, Gojira Effects, and he very kindly gave me that at the Room 2 gig in Glasgow, which I really appreciated. And it's now probably my favourite fuzz I own. From there, it runs into that Boss PH3, which is a phaser. Gets used for pyrotechnic and nothing else in the set, but it's also running as a buffer on that chain, which is something we haven't spoken about yet, but there's a buffer on every chain. The Electro Harmonics on the melody side, which is that delay pedal we spoke about, and then the CE3 is also running as a buffer in the middle chain, and also you've got a buffer at the start there as well. So a well buffered chain, safe to say. And then from there it runs into that Ditto X4 looper pedal on the other side, and then back to the mixer. And then from the mixer we'll run down to this corner here, which is the Gojira Effects 8-bit art. Did a demo on that on the channel, and it's just an amazing pedal. It could do so much cool stuff. I'm using it as a glitch effect for pyrotechnic as well as the phaser, and the same thing with this Line 6 M5. I'm using the, I can't remember what it's called. I'll overlay it, but it's a tremolo effect that they have in there, which again does really cool glitchy stuff. So those are effects for that song as well. And let's say from there it just runs into the Mark bass, which runs as a DI basically. Speakers turned off on the setup. EQ's pretty much flat as well. And yeah, that amp is running really just as a really fancy DI box. I'm not using any of the speaker side of it. I'm using the preamp, which is pretty much flat, and then I'm using half of each of the filters, the VLE and the VPF, which give me like a low and high shelf and a bit of a mid scoop to effectively give me a cab sim. I don't actually run cabinet simulation in my rig, and a lot of people would say otherwise, that you should do that. I just am a huge fan of impulse responses and cabinet simulation. So for me, I prefer that sound. And actually I'm thinking about running a parametric EQ in the future instead of the Mark bass, so I can do the EQ shaping I want and not have to use a cab sim still. So that's as simple as the rig is. It's a pretty sizable pedal board, but everything is serving a job. Oh, and if you ignore my phone, which I've left in on top of the pedal board, it's all powered with the Chox DC7 and the Expander 8 as well. Totally stock cabling for the Chox, nothing too crazy. And all the patch cables on the pedal board are from Practical Patch, who sadly no longer makes cables, but I'm sure whatever he's doing now, he'll be awesome at that too, because he was a great cable builder. And that's it for the pedal board. So next up is the synth table, which is my Modular synth, the Roland TR8, the BeatStep Pro, and my Novation Launchpad Pro, which is the controller for Ableton Live. So we'll cut to that footage now, and then we'll come back and talk a bit more about Ableton. So moving on to the synth table, we're going to start things at the Launchpad Pro. And I'll actually overlay a photo on the screen of it lit up once it's connected to Ableton. So simply put, this is my MIDI controller for triggering clips in Ableton Live. And the whole point of this is so that I can do it with simplicity. I can trigger multiple lanes in Ableton, which you'll see there's multiple channels, which are these columns that are lit up with all the colours. Each one of those, if you were to take the row across to the button on the far right hand side, which is the play buttons, you can trigger that whole row with that one button, and that's all I'm doing. You can get much more complicated than I'm doing with this and do individual clip triggering and things like that. My setup's way simpler than most people's when it comes to Ableton. I'm just triggering all of these layers at the same time. And you'll notice that a few lanes across, there are ones that are all red, a column that's completely red. And that's actually an armed track. It's armed to record, but we're not actually recording it. It just allows us to use that channel and play synth layers that are set up on there via a control keyboard. And that is the main keyboard rig in this current version of the rig. The MIDI controller keyboard, which is a Novation Impulse, is being plugged in Ableton via USB, and because that track is armed, we can hear what's being played on that channel. But like I say, everything else is very simple. These columns are a mix of MIDI lanes, which are basically long MIDI sequences, song length MIDI sequences to control what's going on in this table, and then a couple of sound layers, which are just backing tracks really, for lack of a better term. But when we say backing track, it's not a massive part of the song, it's just the sounds that we can't really justify having someone playing, or they wouldn't be practical to play. Weird effect sounds and sounds that really just wouldn't be practical. In some iterations of the set, there's a song that uses samples of cars driving over the Tay Bridge. There's just no way to manually recreate that, so we use samples in Ableton of that noise. And that's really it for the Novation Launchpad Pro. It's just triggering these elements. And these MIDI lanes that get sent out on the external instrument tracks from Ableton Live are being sent via USB to the Roland TR8, and that's acting as like the MIDI distributor for all of the drum sounds. It's not the greatest setup that way, but it worked perfect for the way we were doing this run of shows. So basically, MIDI notes are sent via Ableton into the Roland TR8, which trigger notes or trigger the drum sounds internally. Then we'll also take a MIDI output from the Roland TR8 that comes into this Banana Split MIDI splitter, which then distributes the MIDI, sending the clock via MIDI cable to my pedal board for the Ditto X4 looper so that the loops are kept clocked, but also sending MIDI into the Arturia BeatStep Pro. From here, those same drum notes that were being sent to the TR8 also being sent to this, and it's converting the MIDI into CV gate pulses, which you can see only 3 cables just now, but that's just for this setup. These cables coming out the back of the BeatStep Pro feeding into the AE Modular, and that's triggering drum sounds within the AE Modular as well. And as you can see, we've only got 3 sounds really set up on the AE Modular right now. That's not always the case. This is quite a stripped back patch we've got just now. The last gig we were playing a shortened set, and we didn't need everything set up for that concert. So we ended up using just a stripped back selection. But you can see there's a lot more going on with the Modular that we could be doing in this setup. It doesn't have to be as stripped back as it currently is. We also have the ability to have chord layers and pad sounds and things like that via the Selena module. We don't use any of that currently in this setup, although there are some songs which previously would have used that. But like I say, this patch is much more streamlined for the last gig we did. It is a way to be getting stripped back and rebuilt actually, to accommodate a lot of new modules from Wonky stuff. In fact, you'll notice a lot of the drum modules, the yellow Castle drum and all of the black micro modules beside it, they're all Wonky stuff drum modules, and they're a big part of my sound, as well as manually making drum sounds via the existing Tangible Waves modules. But there's going to be a lot more done with this in the next setup. In fact, the next setup we're going to be doing away with the TR8 and using the Wonky Stuff MIDI module to do all of the Ableton MIDI to CV gate conversion. So the BeatStep Pro as well will actually be coming out with the rig. Both of these elements will be disappearing, and the Modular is going to be taking up the slack of all of the percussive drums and percussion sounds, really. But you're wondering where this goes from here. So after the Modular, we actually use the Stomp IO module currently, which is, for people that don't know, a way to patch effects pedals into this Modular. It converts the levels, the signal levels, to make the two compliant, in the same way that some line level keyboards don't play well with effects pedals. Modular is no different. The levels in Modular don't always play well with effects pedals, so it allows you to do that conversion. But we've actually been using it as a way of coming out of the Modular and back into the TR8's auxiliary input, or their audio input, so that we're feeding the drums from the Modular into the TR8. And that external in section there that you might be seeing, it has a level control, and we just patch into that. The sidechain's turned up currently, but we don't actually use any of the sidechain functions. And then we take the main output on the back of the TR8 into the 2 pedals at the front here. So we've got a pedal multi-supply, just a cheaper Harley Benton one. It's not the greatest supply in the world, but it does the job for this. And kind of like both these pedals, just cheaper, affordable pedals that'll do the job. We're EQing all of the drum stuff to give it a bit of punch, a little bit of a mid control there. It's actually not normally as drastic as these settings look, but like I say, transportation and sitting for a bit, we need to tweak things a little bit. And then from there we run into the Iron Curtain noise gate, which, if I'm being totally honest with you, is a terrible noise gate pedal. I'm not a massive fan of this one, but it works quite well for the drum machine, so we've still managed to find a home for it. Just adds a bit of punch and a bit of control to things. And then from there it just feeds into a DI box and to front of house. But yeah, expect the next version of this rig to use a lot less hardware in this regard. The TR8 and the BeatStep Pro will be disappearing, and expect the Modular to do all of the drums and percussion. So Ableton Live is a big part of what I do on stage. I'm not particularly happy about that. If I could have my way, there would be no computer in the setup. And I'm still kind of debating that for the gigs next year, is trying to get the computer out of the setup. But for now, it's being used basically as a big MIDI sequencer. I find it a lot easier to program on a platform like that than trying to do elaborate sequencing in the BeatStep Pro. It's a much easier workflow, and you can get a lot more detailed, I feel, without having to put in a lot of menu diving and things like that. We can do everything on face value and really just map out a whole drum track for a song. And that's what I'm doing, mapping out the drums for the song and then sending it via USB to the TR8 and then onto the Modular via the BeatStep Pro, like I said before. There is also 3 channels of backing track sample stuff. Backing tracks is a real dirty word these days. Sadly, if you're doing this style of music, it's impossible to have everything being live. Even in my next setup, where I'm going to have probably 10 or so MIDI lanes coming out of Ableton or whatever is taking its place to sequence all of the MIDI hardware, or MIDI controlled hardware even. Even with that, I still need to have some things put on a track. And the principle for me is it's things that we don't have enough people to play, and it's always things that aren't that important. Background noises, things that it wouldn't be practical or really matter about having it being played live. Plus also things like sound effects. I did touch on it in the rig video, but for instance, the song with the samples of the Tay Bridge, it's an expansion strip with cars driving over it. We're not recreating that on anything. It has to be a sample regardless, whether it's manually triggered or Ableton's triggering it. It's a sample, has to be that way. So in those instances, I'll use Ableton to do that. So there are 3 channels of that in Ableton. There's a drum one, which currently is for songs where I don't have the right modules or the drum machine to make those sounds, but all that will be changing for next year. I've added a whole bunch of modules from Wonky Stuff, who do not sponsor this video, but I do like his t-shirts. And also Tangible Waves themselves have some really cool modules. So I'll be adding stuff from them to finish off the drum sounds and take all of the drums out of Ableton, off of the TR8, just the AE Modular doing those drums. That's the principle for the next setup. And in fact, the album, all the drums will be the AE Modular as well. And the other 3 channels are some samples, things on playback that, let's say, wouldn't be practical to play, and a couple of weird synth-based parts that aren't prominent. They're actually underlying layers that just thicken. They're not even really that audible. They're just there to thicken things up. So there's a couple of those. But even them, they're probably going to come from the modular on the next setup as well, because I have a MIDI controlled oscillator from Wonky Stuff, and I'm desperate to get that in the live setup. So that'll probably take that place as well. The only other aspect that we need to add into Ableton is the keyboards. And my MIDI controller of choice is the Novation Impulse. It's the 49 key version, brilliant piece of kit. Has all this extra stuff like drum pads, things of that nature, but live we don't use any of that. We're just using it as a really high-end MIDI controller. And it does the job brilliantly. Pre-maps to Ableton. Even if something doesn't map the way you want it, it's a couple of button presses away from being mapped, and it's just great. And we're using that to control 2 keyboard sounds in an instrument rack. The thing we do have to watch with Ableton is how much CPU usage you're going through on stage. And you can get a little readout in the corner, which is very helpful for that. All of the MIDI stuff, the MIDI lanes and the sample playback uses virtually none. But as soon as you start playing a keyboard in that setup, it does start to boost the CPU usage. So we don't use any third-party plugins in our setup. There's 2 keyboard sounds. There's like a polysynth brass sound, which is mapped to the whole keyboard on the instrument rack. And then there's a string sound, which is mapped to only part of the keyboard. And they run stacked. There's also an Ableton Chorus plugin, which is just a stock one. And all the plugins we use, there's not a lot of them on our setup, but all of them are stock Ableton plugins. Low latency, or virtually no latency, and very low CPU usage. Perfect setup for us. And we're using that split on the keyboard so that when he plays really low, I say he, my dad plays keyboards for me, which I'm very fortunate to have. To most of you, you'll know him as Andy, or his new project name, Square Neck Waves, where it's lap steel and keyboards. Pretty cool thing he's working on. And when he's playing keyboards for me, the left hand, the really low stuff, is just the brass sound for this kind of fat Moog style bass sound. And then he's got the stack for his right hand, or the higher end stuff, which blends really well. And that's it for the keyboards. There's nothing crazy going on. We do have an Audient Evo 8 interface, which is just taking a stereo output from that into a DI box. That's as simple as it is. There's nothing crazy going on. All of the devices run over USB to the laptop, and then a USB audio interface out of the laptop to the PA. Dead simple. Just a stereo output. We do pre-mix it in Ableton so that we just give that stereo pair to front of house. That brings us on to the last part, which is the rack. So in the rack we have the interface. The laptop sits on top of it on stage currently, And then we also have our power conditioner, which is a Samson power conditioner. I think it's a key element for all live rigs. Have a power conditioner. It just cleans up the power. It's one less thing to worry about. We'll also have a DI rack in there, which is actually broken. It broke during a rehearsal, just stopped working, and I've not had a chance to repair it. But it does serve as a really good shelf. There's a line mixer from Behringer, which we use to pre-mix for certain gigs. I'm not a huge fan of it. One, it's noisy, and two, I just don't think it's great for the control. So we're probably not going to use things like that next year. But it did serve a purpose. And then there's also a reverb in there, which we don't use currently. It was part of my bass rig, but I don't use it really now. So it's just there for when I decide to use it again. Saves storing it in the house as well. There is also 3 preamp pedals, an Eden WTDI, a Behringer BDI-21, and a Behringer GDI-21, which are Tech 21 Sansamp copies, basically, really cheap. Those used to be part of my rig when I ran the rig as 3 separate sounds, but now I'm just using the Mark Bass 1DI, and that Electro Harmonics mixer allows me to have the parallel effects. So they are really just backup plans, along with that CabSim IR pedal, which I hate using, but it's a needs-must backup plan. I'm not a fan of impulse responses. They just don't do it for me. I much prefer EQing out the problematic frequencies with a parametric or the Mark Bass rig. It just works brilliantly for me. That's everything, really. It's all very simple, if I'm honest. You might have noticed the little slugs in the corner as well. They were gifts from my aunt and my little cousin, and they live in the live rig, just as a little memento from the family. And last but not least, I have a bunch of questions that were very kindly left over on my Instagram. And that is probably the best place. If you have any questions about the videos and you don't want to leave comments, you can message me over on my Instagram account as well. So first up, how heavy is the setup? I'm not going to lie, it is a pretty heavy rig. It's not the easiest to transport. It takes a big people carrier type car to get it back and forward from the venue and the studio. But it is important, and I think it's important to use as much hardware to do as much of it live as possible. And I think that's just the price you pay. Is it's quite a big bulky rig, and I don't think I'd really want it any other way. Next up, we'll have a question about the pedals, and that is, the pedals all have little twiddly knobs. How do you tweak them if you need to, or do they all have presets? No, there are very few presets, and I do have to, when I'm doing the sound check that everything is set how I wanted it. There's always room for adjustment here and there, and that's what keeps it fresh on stage as well. But yeah, I do have to double check all of my settings before I call sound check done. There is one pedal with a preset, the H5, but M5 even. But even then, it's just a sound preset. It's nothing too crazy. Yeah, all need to be tweaked. Next question is a really good one. If you could have anything, how big would the rig get? And also, if you had to manage with half as much, what would it be? Well, that actually ties into how next year's rig will be running. Because next year, half of that table, I keep pointing over here because it is sat beside me, half of it will disappear. The drum machine is going to being studio only. The Beat Step Pro will be a backup plan. The Modular is going to probably get quite a bit bigger though, and that's going to be the real bulk of that table now, is the Modular. It's going to take up all of the drums and percussion, some of the synth-based stuff, maybe even some pads and things like that using the Selena. So yeah, it's not necessarily going to become a bigger rig, but I'd expect that to take up a lot more real estate as part of the rig compared to the way it is now. And I'm also working on getting the laptop out if possible. I don't know if I've stressed it enough, but I really don't like having a laptop in the rig, but it is a necessary evil right now. And that leads on to the next question quite well. There is a balance between the machines taking over and still doing enough live. How do you juggle this? That's exactly it. It's a tough act to juggle, but I think trying to make as much live as possible, it does bring risks of things going wrong, but that's how you know it's live. To me, try and play as much live as you can and only put the things that have to be on a track on a track. That also means maybe MIDI sequencing things so that it's still hardware playing, it still has room for error, but using the computer to sequence equipment rather than backing tracks where we can. Next up, if a pedal fails, what is the backup plan? Good question. I do have some redundancy in the pedals. Like there's maybe a fuzz for this and a fuzz for something else. But if one goes, I can swap to the other. The real problem would be if it wasn't true bypass and something went, then it might actually kill the audio. That does bother me, and I'm thinking about putting some of these loop switchers into my rig for that very scenario. So, very good question. We are looking at that for next year's gigs. How long does it take to set up and tear down for a gig? We figured this out recently. It's about half hour to set up and a half hour to tear down. So not too long at all, actually. It's a pretty well-oiled machine between the two of us. And yeah, about half an hour, so not too bad. How do you remember what goes where? It's a good question. It took quite a bit of time just to get into the flow of understanding the rig, and then also teaching my dad how his side of the rig works so he can set up his part. After we got that down and did it 3 or 4 times though, it's kind of second nature now. We're a pretty well-oiled machine. And possibly my favourite question of this section, do you need special shoes like a racing driver? There's 2 answers to this. No, you don't need special shoes, but I have special shoes for my looping rig. I think for looping it's important you have consistency. So I try to use the same style of shoe for all looping so I get used to how the pedals feel under my feet, and particularly the loopers switches. I've tried using boots, it's too heavy-handed, or heavy-footed I suppose. I just need something that I can actually feel the switches under my feet. And I'm pretty obsessed with the brand Vans as it is. I would say 90% of the shoes I wear are Vans. So I do have specific Vans for the live rig. Slip-on, proper emo stuff. I am an elder emo these days. So yep, these are the beasties. Slip-on Vans, they do the trick for me. I have also used other Vans in the past, but what I do think is cool about having special shoes for the looping is you don't wear them in the street. So your pedals don't really get dirty. I usually keep these in a bag with like a change of clothes for on stage anyway. So I put on special shoes for on stage that do not get dirty in the street, which keeps all my pedals clean as well. So you don't need them, but I think it's a good idea actually. And a couple of questions, slightly less about the rig, but I thought they were still really interesting ones. AI is taking over everything. Will there be an AI pedal soon? I really hope not. I have no problem with AI. I just think something about circuitry impresses me. But then digital pedals have existed for years as well. So I don't know, I'm a little bit conflicted. If it's really cool technology and makes a really fun product that is still creative, then I'm all for it. I have no problem with it. As long as it doesn't encroach on any kind of ethical principles when it's doing it, I'm fine with it. And if you weren't allowed a stringed instrument, what would you play instead? That's a really good question. I actually think it would be a combination of modular synth and drums, because I really enjoy playing drums when I can. I'm by no means a good drummer. I know very little about the instrument, but I do enjoy it when I get the chance. So probably that actually. That would probably be, for me, modular synth or drums. And that wraps up for today's video. Some really great questions there. Thank you so much to everybody that's asked for this video, left questions, requested this a bunch of times. I can't believe it's taken so long to film it. I'm sorry about the delay. And I will have to now reshoot this again next year when I redo the rig for those gigs as well. But I just want to say thank you so much to everybody that watches, everybody that's liked, commented, subscribed over the last few years, especially in that spell where I wasn't doing any videos as well. I really appreciate all of that. So thank you again so much for the constant support. If you do want to keep supporting the channel, you can like and comment on this video. Feel free to share it with your friends, share the channel. And if you want to see more content from me, subscribe, clicking the bell icon down below. And until next time, keep working on those bass faces.